Well, thank you, Stephen Whitlock, for joining us today. You are a chief strategist for Boeing in their IT department. You do internet security specifically in Seattle, Washington. And do you currently live in Seattle, Washington right now?
No, I live here. So I,
Okay.
I retired about 3 years ago.
Okay.
So I'm no longer at Boeing. I've turned that over to whoever's doing that now. I am continuing to do some cybersecurity volunteer work for standards organizations and for the U.S. federal government.
Wonderful. And on the side, you are also an avid reader of Latter-day Saint scholarship and involved in this community in quite a large way. So in what ways were you involved in preparing this Hugh Nibley observed volume?
So I was probably the first editor going through the different chapters as we collected them and just reading them through for look and feel and content and trying not to change anything to change an author's style. And then I photographed most of the photos in there from the archives, and then we collected them from various, the Nibley family and others, and I did most of the editing on the photos.
Wow. What was your favorite part about working with those photographs or the process of curating them, I guess?
It's probably not all that exciting, but trying to take an old photograph and bring it out so you can see the light and dark shadows. I've done a lot of that with family history, personal family history photos. So we wanted to have nice, readable photos where you could see the people in them. And some of the sources weren't good, some were great.
And that was striking for me as I was flipping through the volume and the PDF, just seeing those beautiful images that I'd never seen of Hugh Nibley before. Because I'm a younger person, I'd always only seen him as an old man, and so to see his young childhood photos or him as a young man who was quite handsome, I might add, was really refreshing to just kind of see this as a human life, not just a scholar I had heard about growing up.
I pushed for the cover photo, because I've always seen him as an old man as well, and I
Yeah.
wanted something that would show the young, dynamic, passionate Hugh Nibley, and that photo captures it for me.
So how were you introduced to Hugh Nibley overall? Did you grow up reading him? What were some of your favorite texts of Hugh Nibley?
I grew up reading him, and I can't remember when it started. It really started coming into focus when I was going to Weber State College at the time for my bachelor's degree. And I would stop at Deseret Industries on the way home, and they had these huge archives of church manuals and magazines. They had the Improvement era back to the 1920s, and I started collecting them. And many of his books were serialized in that publication, and I started collecting his and others and reading them, and I just really liked his style.
Sure. And why would you think that Hugh Nibley's work is important?
I think that he was, and I have to relate to my security work in that I was a generalist also, and I think he was a generalist that saw connections that others didn't see, partly probably because of his memory and the breadth that he read. He essentially laid the foundation for most of the scholarship today, and the younger generation now is forgetting him. When I was photographing his photos in the library, and one of the other things about that was just discovering new photos of him and his family. But the younger people there didn't know who he was, didn't recognize his name or anything. And even though in some specialized areas work has moved on, they still built on this foundation. And I've been rereading the collected works now, and I'm surprised at how much insight there is still buried in there that we have essentially forgotten, or I've forgotten. But
Yeah, and there's a lot that people in my generation and beyond have never heard of, because Hugh Nibley is not necessarily a household name like it used to be when, for example, his work was the priesthood manual in the church. But I love what you talked about you both being a generalist, because you mentioned in your chapter about how you worked in cybersecurity all the way back in the 80s when that was just barely becoming a field. And you've seen in your lifetime how that field has just accelerated and flourished. And now there's specialists in the field and it's huge. Whereas you were a pioneer back in the day. And it kind of parallels Hugh Nibley, how he was still in that era coming out of the famous biblical archaeologists like William F. Albright and Flinders Petrie. And now we've seen biblical scholarship also become very specialized, and it's just an interesting development. So I guess my question is, What have you found most striking about the development of Latter-day Saints scholarship?
The volume seems to keep increasing, which is one reason why you can't be a generalist too much anymore.
Yeah.
Back on my cybersecurity, when I was first on the internet, the entire internet was around 425 computers. That was in the
mind-blowing.
early 80s. And when I started doing security, I think there was a person in my company that wrote policies, but there was no technology. I was doing research in cryptography and security standards. And when I left, there was an organization of 400 people. There's kind of a parallel with church scholarship in that there are more and more people, and this is a good thing, but it's hard to master it all or even become familiar with it. So there are now specialists in different areas, and I appreciate their work. It's getting to where I can't read it all anymore.
Yeah, it's true, and it's a tough balance because the more the field expands, the more you have to be a specialist, but at the same time, it's easy to lose the forest for the trees when you're not also trying to be a little bit interdisciplinary and trying to be more of a generalist, which is why Hugh Nibley in a large way was such a treasure because he had such a vast knowledge and a vast memory. And even in Book of Mormon studies specifically, we're seeing a grand flourishing, but we still kind of are a little bit in a generalist phase. You still can be a little bit of a generalist on the Book of Mormon because it's still such a young field, but we're definitely heading into that, and it's been remarkable for me to kind of see the development.
One of the things I like about Hugh Nibley's writings is you can get caught up in your day-to-day life, and then you go back and read a lot of his writings, and he brings you back to the basics, essentially to the plan of salvation and why we're here on earth. Our general authorities do that as well, and other scholars, but Hugh Nibley for me had a unique way of writing where he didn't talk down to you. It was almost like a conversation with him where he was really excited about something he had just learned and he wanted to share.
Which is remarkable for someone as brilliant as he is. He could very easily be pedantic, but instead he was very approachable.
I find that, and I know that some people are afraid to read his writings because they're assuming they can't, but they're not hard to read, most of them. He does have a broad vocabulary, and you might have to look things up, but most things you can tell by context.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite book of Hugh Nibley's?
That's a tough question. I tend to prefer the commentaries or the discourses related to the scriptures, but also his writings on the temple and basically on the plan of salvation. But that may cover most of his books.
Likewise, his work on the temple has been most influential for me. So you had an interesting experience where you came in contact with a manuscript of Hugh Nibley's. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. In the 70s, when I was going to Weber State, I went there 2 years. The first year I worked on the grounds of the Ogden Institute, I think that's its former title, at Weber State College. And I got to be pretty close to most of the professors, and I became good friends with Lars Jorgensen, who was, I think, teaching church history. And he had this manuscript. It was 155 type pages, no name, no author, just paper. And he let me make a copy, and I read it, and I knew instantly it was Hugh Nibley's writing style. It was typed with random Greek words handwritten in, and it was about the early apostasy of the Christian church. And so I made a copy and kept it and read it a couple times, and then later took the job with Boeing in the Seattle area. And during that time I was called to be an early morning seminary teacher, which I did for 12 years. And the church had seminary symposiums at BYU. So I came in 1991 with my wife to one of the symposiums, and we stayed at Gene England's house, who was a close friend of Hugh Nibley's. And Gene just lived a block or two north of campus. And I brought the manuscript to show Gene to see if he could authenticate it. And he was pretty excited about it and said, well, just go ask Hugh. And I had never met Hugh, was not going to just call him up out of the blue. And so Gene called the Nibley home and handed me the phone. And the next thing I knew, I was talking to Phyllis Nibley, and I told her about it, and she said, well, he's at the library, and just go show it to him. So I walked over to the campus, and when it was before they'd rebuilt the library the way it is now, and I went in, I think he was in the previous ancient studies room. It was much larger than the room now. And there was a an office with a door you walked in and a secretary, and then a door behind her. And that was how they gated people to keep them from bothering him, I suppose. And I told her I had a manuscript. She said, he's really busy. And I said, I just want him to identify this. And she said, well, go on in. I said, I don't know what he looks like. She said, well, there's 2 men in there. He's the old one. So I went in and walked up to him, and he said, if you must know, I'm really busy. And I said, well, I just want you to authenticate this manuscript. And he looked at it, and he started bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet. He got tremendously excited, which made me excited. And he said, this is my New Testament class. I thought these notes were lost forever. And he said it was from the 50s. He asked if he could have a copy. I talked to him a little bit about some other stuff, and he autographed The Ancient State, Volume 10 in the collected series for me. And in the note he said, don't lose this, there might be something in it. And Gene had told me not to give him the original because he would lose it. So I went back to his secretary, and she and I went to a copy machine where we had about an hour and made 3 copies, one for Gene, one for Hugh, and one for Farms. And then I took the copy down to Farms back when they were 7th South, maybe down in downtown Provo. And they looked at it and they said, you know, there's no footnotes, this is really rough, there's handwritten Greek, we'll never publish it, but here's some tapes and thank you for the manuscript. And then I went home. About 5 years later, it came out as Volume 15, the Apostles and Bishops in Early Christianity. And so I was pretty excited that it got published, and I didn't know if it came from mine or his secretary said he probably had copies in his garage and in his house. And I never did see his garage or house, but it sounded pretty chaotic. I found out much later from Jack Welch that in helping, I think he was helping Nibley move his stuff out near the end of Hugh's life, that they had found the original and Jack shepherded it through publication. It may be a little rougher around the edges than some of the other volumes in the collected works, but it's really good material. I'm glad that it finally got published.
Wow, that really is such a gem that we have that. What a cool experience. So last question, how has Hugh Nibley influenced your life?
I think that sometimes when I get caught up in other things and then go read some of his material, it helps ground me a little bit. It's reinforced my career interest to be just stay be a generalist. I like that approach. If I could, I would read everything that I could. I can't, and I can't read the languages he read. But I would say a corrective on perspective of life.
Yeah, that's profound, and I really appreciate all the perspectives I've been hearing from you and Shirley Ricks and Jack Welch about all the different ways Hugh Nibley was not just a good scholar, but a wonderful human being, and I appreciate your perspectives on that too.
It's been a great project, and I should say that the scriptures are the real thing that grounds you, but Hugh Nibley points you back to the scriptures and to Christ.
100%. Thank you for joining us. This has been a great experience, and I really have appreciated learning more about Hugh Nibley, so thank you.